we should be always interested and care about human rights in North Korea?
I think most people can see that human rights everywhere is an issue for everyone.
All of us as human beings possess certain rights and freedoms that cannot be taken away or transferred. "75 years ago, the United Nations General Assembly adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and set out the fundamental rights and freedoms that are universally recognized and protected. But we continue to see those rights threatened. The job of protecting them falls on the shoulders of everyone, but especially people like our globalists today, James Heenan, who represents the UN Human Rights Office in Seoul. He explains why he is so busy being stationed in the capital of South Korea, dealing with human rights issues in North Korea. So, James, welcome to the Globalist.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me on the program.
We're glad to have you here. Now, you have been in your present position since October, so it's now about 6 months, going past 6 months. I'm not sure you'd be considered a newcomer any longer. So what has been the biggest learning curve? What has been the biggest difference that has been made about your job here?
Well, I've never worked on Northeast Asia before. I've worked in many other places. So this is a new part of the world for me with new challenges, unique challenges. 6 months is not a long time. I've met hundreds of people, maybe thousands of people already, all linked to the issue of human rights in North Korea and the Democratic Republic of Korea. And I've been able to get a sense of not just the issues as they are today, but also the history, which is very important, and also the culture. I guess it's building a bedrock for me to move forward. I've also used the time to explore this great city and this great country.
But tell us a little bit about what you do in your office in Seoul.
Well, our office is very specifically mandated to do very specific things. We have been asked by the international community, the member states of the United Nations, to monitor what's going on in DPRK, as we call it, North Korea, from a human rights perspective, to document it, to analyse it legally, and to report on it publicly. We put out a number of public reports. We also work with escapees here from the north, here in South Korea.
People that have left North Korea.
People who have left North Korea, escapees, and who have arrived here. And we're also specifically mandated to look at what we say are pathways to accountability. So rather than just saying, these violations of human rights, right to life, right to food, are happening, actions should have some consequences. So there should be some accountability down the track for those violations. And so we are specifically asked to explore that, explore what might be possible.
Let's take the first part of your job here, finding out what is happening in North Korea about a country that you're not able to have access to must come with a whole set of challenges. How do you deal with that?
Well, it's not the only place in the world where this happens. In fact, it's depressingly fairly common. We have protocols to get information when we're not in the country. The difference with this situation is that in other places, you would have a vibrant civil society in the country. You would have people coming in and out who you could talk to and so forth. At the moment, with DPRK in North Korea, that doesn't happen. There's no civil society groups to talk to in the north, independent civil society groups to talk to, and people aren't leaving or entering the country since COVID. There's been essentially a complete closure. So our information comes from, we have interviewed a number of people who have left North Korea in the past, hundreds we've interviewed. There are other sources of information using technology. But there's a lot of information also comes from the public pronouncements of the government. It's very clear that they identify what issues are of most concern to them at the moment. And triangulating all of those things together, we can come up with a rough idea of what's happening there at the moment.
From the South Korean point of view, and we've considered North Korea one of the most closed societies in the world, a hermit kingdom of the most extreme kind. Is it more difficult to gather your information and really confirm its credibility and all of that, the process itself?
Well, we have to think about before COVID and during COVID. So COVID gave the reason to close the country, and that happened in many countries.
Yes.
Yeah, it's just that it's gone on a bit longer in respect of North Korea. That has made it clearly more difficult. Previously, there would have been about 1,000 escapees arriving in the Republic of Korea from the north every year. So clearly that's made an impact. But previously, before COVID, there was quite a lot of information flow. We, as a UN organisation, we take a two-track approach. We monitor, but we also engage. In fact, we monitor to engage. We monitor in order to have the information to be able to give recommendations to the government on how to improve their human rights situation. And in the past, that worked relatively well, surprisingly. We were able to formulate recommendations. They might not have always been taken on board, but we were able to have that sort of engagement. COVID has made all of those activities much more difficult because it's very hard to even engage, it's very hard to even talk to the government at the moment.
The government of North Korea?
Yes.
Oh, so there has been interactions pre-COVID in terms of the human rights issues?
Absolutely. They take place in Geneva and New York and the headquarters level. It's that sort of level. But and our office is an office that gathers the information. But absolutely, the United Nations always works on an engagement principle because DPRK is a member state of our organisation.
So beyond the fact that COVID has made it difficult on a number of areas, does your recommendations have impact on human rights activities in North Korea?
Well, that's always a difficult question because you could say that about every country. I've worked in many countries and the UN provides recommendations on human rights for every member state in the whole world. I can tell the fact that the government does engage in a limited way, but more importantly, that it reacts to what we say. It mightn't be the reaction we want, but the government, like every government, is keenly concerned about its human rights reputation. That might come as a surprise, but my assessment is that they are keenly concerned about the human rights reputation and they respond to pretty well everything that we say. They give back information or positions. Again, we mightn't agree with them, but there's certainly that sort of public level of engagement.
So I guess that sort of leads into my next question. Is that one of the reasons that we should be always interested and care about human rights in North Korea?
At the moment, it's a difficult time for human rights globally. In the past, it might have been that people were like, we're not so interested in what happens outside of our country. But in this globalized world, I think most people can see that human rights everywhere is an issue for everyone because it will impact on us. It will impact on peace and security, clearly. It can impact on things like climate change. So I think that's a basic reason why we should be concerned about human rights in DPRK. All countries, but particularly DPRK. And when you're talking about DPRK in the Republic of Korea, the proximity and the fact that you're on the Korean peninsula, I think people are also much more keenly aware of what human rights are all about. And I've never worked in a country where people don't understand injustice. I think when people see injustice, it hits them. Yeah. Now, with somewhere like DPRK, you might have some fatigue. People might say, well, that's been going on for so long, it's impossible, what are we going to do? I think the only way we're going to see an improvement in the human rights situation in that country is through long-term work. And we certainly have phenomenal people, particularly here in the Republic of Korea, who keep the focus on the suffering of many people in the north.
North Korea being the closed society that it is, it's hard to engage because you have to have, I guess, stories or cases in which you can sort of engage a global audience. Is that a difficult thing in terms of North Korea?
Well, it's difficult right now, but we have 33,000 North Koreans living in the Republic of Korea, all with their own stories, often all with their own incredible stories, which are in the media more and more. I think particularly the last year, I've noticed that there's more and more of these stories in the media, people telling how they escaped, telling what happened, telling what it felt like leaving their children behind or their parents behind. That, together with a greater appreciation of historic things like enforced disappearances, people whose parents were forcibly disappeared to the north, and the suffering that that engendered for them for a lifetime. And that's getting more airtime. That's in my view, that's true, yes.
You've just led into this enforced disappearance issue, and that's a report that you just released.
좀 한번 죽기 전에 한번 봤으면 좋겠어요.
생사 확인이 제일 중요한 건 있으니 그 생사 확인을 했으면 좋겠고, 만약에 이북에서 돌아가셨다면은 6월이라도 반환받고 싶다.
납치 때부터 아버지의 어떤 삶을 살으셨나, 그걸 알아야지 더 속이 풀리니까.
The report makes very clear recommendations to the Democratic Republic of Korea, essentially around transparency, right to truth, what happened to these individuals, accountability, holding those accountable for what happened, but also non-repetition, which is a legal term meaning putting in place measures to make sure that these awful crimes do not occur again.
Crimes against foreign countries.
What is enforced disappearance?
Enforced disappearance is a serious human rights violation, but it's also a crime. It's where a state makes a person disappear and refuses to acknowledge that the state is holding that person or their whereabouts or their fate. So it's not like being arrested, because if you're arrested, you know the person's in the police station or the prison. It really is a disappearance. It comes from what happened during the Second World War in particular, where the practice started. The idea normally is to spread fear amongst the population, and people just disappear without a trace, and we never know what happens to them. With respect to DPRK, it's a little different. There's many, many instances of enforced disappearance. We think probably over 200,000.
200,000?
Yes. Now, there's many different types. One type, probably the best known type are the Japanese abductees,
Yes.
the young people who were taken from Japan and disappeared, absolutely disappeared. But there's also prisoners of war from the south who were never returned from the north after the war. Civilians taken after the war, like the Korean airliner incident, or fishermen who have been kidnapped. There's also people from other countries. It's not just Japan. We have Romania, Lebanon, the United States, many countries where individuals have been forcibly disappeared. And what our report tries to do is bring all that together into one analysis. What's important about enforced disappearance is that it is a continuing crime. It doesn't end until we know what happened to the person.
And is that why the report that you have there is titled "The Wounds Do Not Heal"?
Well, yes, exactly, because that's a quote from one of the victims, the families, and they just said this is a wound that never heals, even after 40, 50, 60 years.
Yeah.
We thought about calling the report "No Time to Wait" because the people who were disappeared and their families are all getting older and older. And so to have some justice within their lifetimes, there is no time to wait on this issue.
Can you tell us of just to sort of give us an idea in terms of a South Korean family who is going through this, what is a story that is a typical enforced disappearance?
Well, one would be a teenager or a young man who goes off to another city for a trip or holiday to see someone and never comes back.
That's a story that we've heard a lot from the Japanese in terms of them being abducted to so-called teach Japanese in North Korea.
Well, exactly, that's true. But in this country, the person would just disappear, and the parents didn't know what happened to him, just disappeared into thin air. 10, 15 years later, even 20 years later, some small bit of information comes from someone who's been in the north who says, that there was someone who was from the south who said they were from Daejeon or Daegu or whatever. And that opens the window again for this grieving family that the person was abducted and may still be alive. And in that meantime, the people are disbelieved, the family is disbelieved, or they are subject to suspicion that they helped their son was a spy or something. So, but they don't come back, and that's the thing. There's no return of the person, there's no return of the remains, there's no idea of whether they married and had children, there's no idea of where they were buried if they died.
We know about the Japanese issue because the Japanese government has brought it up as in many cases, and they've made it public. So that is one instance where a political decision about raising human rights, I guess, helps to try to resolve it in some ways. But does making human rights a political issue help or hurt the process?
Well, some people say human rights is inherently political. It's all about, if I had to give a definition of human rights, it's restraining state power. That's what it's all about. It's saying that the state cannot do whatever it wants to people. There are limits, yeah? I think there will always be an aspect of politics in it, and human rights will always be co-opted by one side of politics or the other. I think the easiest way to move forward, and I've worked in difficult places, is to make it clear that you're just basing yourself on the framework of law, of international law. We have a very clear international legal framework, which I've talked about on enforced disappearance. And as long as you stay on the law and you say this is arbitrary detention or this is enforced disappearance, you can swing that either way you want, but this is what the law says, you're on safe ground. As soon as you start deviating off that and saying, this is my opinion of this is my opinion of that, then I think you can get a bit lost into politics. But what we're talking about in respect of North Korea, it's pretty clear in legal terms what the violations are. Now, in terms of trying to resolve a situation, it's not politics for a country to try to protect the rights of its citizens. It's, in fact, if anything, the governments of ROK and Japan and others, they have an obligation to try to find out what happened to these people. And this is what we say in the report. They have an obligation to, as we say, respect the right to truth of these people.
So, James, you told me that you've worked in different countries. Has always been human rights for you?
Well, almost. Yeah, I've worked in human rights for 25 years, most of it with the UN. Previously, I was an academic and a lawyer, but always been a link with human rights in my work. Yeah.
Why?
Well, first of all, my work has always been linked to human rights, be it criminal law or labour law before. I'm very aware of how privileged I am because of where I come from, because of my education, and because of the support that's been given to me in my life. And because of my work, I've been up close, as we say, up close and personal with people who haven't had the same advantages. And in fact, people who have been subject to the sorts of pressure from governments that I just can't even imagine in their daily lives. And that gives me energy, and that confirms my decision to work in human rights.
To sort of offer them the opportunities that you had would be a great motivation.
Yeah, and just to stand up for people who are a bit more powerless. Now, I'm not saying they need me to stand up for them or the United Nations, but you just come across people again and again who are in such a desperate situation and they're looking for help from anywhere. And it mightn't be newsworthy, it mightn't be on the front page, but they just need someone in their corner. And we know that unchecked state power can be overwhelming. Like, this is why we always talk about transparency and participation and so forth, because when there's a shadow, when things, we don't know what's happening in certain places, you know, for example, in DPRK and North Korea now, we know that bad things happen when there's a shadow, when there's no transparency.
When there's no light.
Exactly.
In a way, that's sort of what my line of work in the past, media, was supposed to do. Do you work with the media a lot? Is that a hands-on process?
We do. The media is key. And on some of the most difficult issues, for example, here now working on North Korea, when you have the serious constraints we have at doing normal human rights work, a lot of our role is advocacy, which involves the media.
Communicating.
Exactly.
How is the human rights situation in North Korea different from human rights situations in other countries?
In simple terms, it's not. There's nothing new in North Korea that we haven't seen in other places. What we see is it taken in some cases to extreme levels. That's what we see. So what is important to remember is that the government in DPRK, which is a member state of the UN, it doesn't repudiate the human rights framework. It doesn't say, no, we don't agree with human rights. They've signed on to human rights treaties. They say they're bound by human rights. They say they fulfill human rights. And in some cases, they say we're a human rights paradise. For example, in respect of women's rights, they say equal participation of women has been totally achieved, so we're all fine. So it's not like they're rejecting the sorts of messages we're giving. It's just trying to find a language that we can say, well, let's see what's happening on the ground and let's see if we can improve that. And that's where there are opportunities, because progress will only really come through engagement at the end of the day. You have to continue to monitor and document and publicly call out violations. You have to continue to look for pathways to accountability, be it in the International Criminal Court or national criminal courts, and say those responsible will have to render account for this. And my point is that at least we have the language of human rights to engage on. Now, many people would say, well, the acceptance of human rights is just, it's co-option.
Yeah.
They're just pretending. Quite a lot of member states can be like that on issues, I'll have to say. It's not just DPRK. But at least it gives us a table to sit at, let me put it that way, the human rights table.
And on the subject of women in North Korea, is women in North Korea not a human rights issue?
It's a huge human rights issue. We have a report on that as well, but importantly, the special rapporteur on North Korea and human rights, who's an independent expert working for the UN, Professor Salmon, she's recently released a report on this in detail. What we see is that women and girls suffer from the human rights violations that the whole population can suffer from, but there are specific aspects. There's a gendered aspect to this, yeah? So, for example, in detention, women suffer ill treatment and harassment and sexual violence, access to sexual and reproductive, well, their rights, but in particular, personal hygiene issues, access to their children. We also have women who try to escape across into other countries if they're returned, they're subjected to very gendered processes, including forced body searches and so forth. And violence against women, domestic violence against women, is a real problem in DPRK, and the government says it's trying to address it, but the laws aren't in place and the acknowledgement isn't there that this is an issue. Now, this violence against women in the home is something that every country has dealt with, and it's also an issue in North Korea.
I hear you've never been to North Korea.
Never.
Do you expect ever to go?
No.
Why not?
The government in DPRK has specifically rejected the work that our office in Seoul has been asked to do. Most countries don't like UN resolutions that target justice. So I don't think I will be invited to go, but I would like to go. I would like to be in Pyeongyang because that's where we should be. The role of the UN in human rights is not just finger pointing, it's trying to improve the situation. And usually, always, that involves working with the government to improve the situation. So I hope that time comes. So maybe I was wrong, maybe sometime I will go, but not in the foreseeable future.
Well, if the efforts come to fruition, that will be the day that you will go.
Absolutely, and I'll let you know.
I will try to go with you.
Absolutely, you're more than welcome.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And that's it from me. Next week, I'll be back with another globalist who's putting Korea on the map. Sun Ji out.